I promise I do read properly. She's currently an adjunct assistant professor of writing at Columbia University and a fiction editor for the Brooklyn Rail. Donna Hemans is the author of two previous novels, River Woman and Tea by the Sea, which won the Lignum Vitae Unimarson Award. Her short fiction and essays have appeared in Electric Literature, Miss Magazine, and Crab Orchard Review, among others. She's also the owner of DC Writers Room, a co working studio for writers based in Washington, D.C. Donna was born in Jamaica. She lives in Maryland and received her undergraduate university degree in English and Media Studies from Fordham University and an MFA from American University. And the end of this, I really hope that all of you go out and buy their books, which are outside in the cafe. And without further ado, I'm going to welcome them both to the stage. Can you help me?
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. So I do want to, and first of all, thank you to the Center for Fiction for hosting this event. Thank you for BCLF for sponsoring this event as well. I think before, I want to have Donna do a reading from her new book, but I think before I kind of want to talk about Donna's journey a little bit, because she is an experienced writer. This is her third novel. And the last time we were together was at the Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival, and we were on a panel that was focused on, authors in between novels. And Donna's book is obviously out. Mine is mine is still in flux. I think as somebody who's written 3 books, I think it's really interesting to hear about that journey. So I kind of want to know. Since your first book, River Woman, was published in 2002, kind of how has the literary landscape changed for Caribbean writers? Like, what have you noticed?
Right. Yeah, well, first, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and it really is a pleasure to be here. Things have changed a lot. And I think, back in 2002 and before that, a lot of the books that Caribbean writers were writing, or that was expected of Caribbean writers, really just focused on the immigrant experience in America or in Europe. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it was really looking at how the immigrant maneuvered and moved around and survived in this new environment. And I think now a lot of the stories are just very different. Yeah. I think in some ways we have been allowed, or maybe we have given ourselves permission to step outside of that box and write more of the stories that I guess we want to write, that are, show the broader diversity of the Caribbean in general and of our stories. So I think that, to me, is the biggest change, really just seeing more stories, different stories, seeing writers really embracing writing in Caribbean dialect, for one, a lot more, and not necessarily feeling that they need to explain too much or use footnotes, because I've seen footnotes. Yeah. So I think there's a big shift.
Yeah.
There is a...
Yeah, and I remember, I love Michelle Cliff. She was one of the my biggest influences, but I remember reading, I think it was a Bang in college, and having a glossary. I think a lot of Caribbean writers, when they first published, had to have a glossary kind of explaining everything. But yeah, we both published novels during the pandemic, but I think, they were able to be widely promoted, and I think it was because of the work of the Brooklyn Caribbean Lit Festival and also the Center for Fiction. There's so many more organizations acknowledging that there is a diverse readership for Caribbean literature, whereas I felt like before it was kind of pigeonholed into, a tiny little box. Yeah. So I do also want to begin by having you read a little selection from this novel.
Sure. So I'll read from the first chapter. And, well, actually, let me say what the book is about so I can explain this little section that we're reading. So The House of Plain Truth is a story about a woman, Pearline, who gives up her life in Brooklyn and goes back to Jamaica to help take care of her dying father. And he asks her 2 things. One is to be his memory, and the second is to find her siblings who had been left behind in Cuba. So as the story unfolds, you get a sense of why these siblings were left behind in Cuba and the stories that her father wants her to hold on to. So the section I'm going to read is in the very first chapter, in which in which Rupert, right after he remembers the names of his children, or he says them out loud. Rupert named his children, and now Pearline begins to think that some people refuse to be forgotten. These siblings of hers who have lived only in her family's collective memory of a moment on a wharf in Santiago de Cuba, want to be heard. That moment, which marks the last time the living members of her family were together, is stamped in her memory. She replays it now, as she has done over the years. Rupert wears his best suit and hat. He's never without his hat. And her mother, Irene, wears a starched white dress, her belly big with the baby she would name Ermina. Pearline is 4 and Eileen 7. Those are the two girls who returned in 1933 to Jamaica. Their oldest sister, Annie, is already a married woman who chooses to stay behind in Cuba. And David and Gerardo, soon-to-be men, are staying behind too. Irene extracts a promise from Annie to take care of the boys. The goodbyes are loud and long, and the voices like a cacophony of birds, English and Haitian Creole spoken by the people who are leaving, and Spanish from those overseeing the departures. Annie leans over, whispers, "On a clear day, you can see Cuba from there." Pearline believes her, and she and Eileen look out at the blue sea for a glimpse of the distant land. And then they're gone. The last 2 baby girls in the family repatriated at the government's expense to an island they had never known. Ermina was nearly born on the ship, but Irene makes it to shore before the baby comes. There isn't room on the ship even for a song. A single whistle maybe, but not a song. Rupert wants no disturbance, no outward signs of displeasure or anxiety or disappointment. A ship's passage paid for by the government isn't the way he wants to return home. He wants to come home like the men who went to Panama, the Colon man with his gold chain and pocket watch. So he finds fault in everything: the waves that rock the boat, the men who report from deck on the land visible in the distance, the clouds that roll behind, threatening rain. Pearline and Eileen, nervous and fidgeting, looking forward. From where they stand, there is no looking back. Even if they could have looked back, Rupert would have ordered them not to. From the moment he stepped onto the ship, he turned his back on Cuba and his children left behind on the wharf, until now, this moment when he calls the forbidden names.
Okay, thank you. So I wonder if you could begin by just talking about how you came to write this novel, kind of from your moment of inspiration to the actual path to publication.
Well, the actual path to publication was probably close to, no, it's not quite 20 years. I can't do math, but I started writing this book in 2006, and we're now in 2024, so that's, 18 years? Am I right? But the idea for the book came to me largely because my grandparents went to Cuba in 1919 and returned to Jamaica in 1931. And I knew just basic facts that they were there, that, one of my grandmother was pregnant when she came back to Jamaica. So little details like that, but not the specific nitty-gritty details about their lives in Cuba. And so I wanted to try to understand what it was like. What was their experience living in this country 90 miles away from Jamaica? And why did they choose to come back to Jamaica? So that really is where the whole thing started. There was a second piece to it too, is that one of the other stories I had heard was that one of my grandmother's brothers went to Cuba and just never came back to Jamaica at all. So I was also fascinated by this idea that you could just simply, forget your family existed for whatever reason. And I wanted to try to figure out what it really felt like to search for or to look for, try to rebuild that kind of connection. And I think, this is the sort of thing that happens, I think probably a lot more than we, really think about, or at least a lot more than I think about. Because there are some people who, are certainly able to very easily step back away from family. sometimes for good reasons, sometimes, unexplained reasons, but, that really is what I was trying to understand.
Yeah, I think one thing that really hooked me in right away was hearing that piece of history that I had heard talked about in my own family too. Like I was told my great-grandfather had lived in Cuba, but no one had any other information. And I couldn't find any records to confirm or, so it was just fascinating because there are these little bits of history you get, but there's not a lot of records. And I love doing genealogy, but the records are wrong dates, wrong names. Like it's very difficult. So how much did you kind of rely on your family to get this information? How much was it research or imagination or?
More research and imagination than actually relying on my family members. My grandparents had long been dead by the time I got around to really thinking about, like family history or stories in terms of my life as a writer. And so I couldn't get information from them. And my father and uncles and, relatives don't remember very much either. Or whatever little they got probably wasn't enough to give me a really good sense of what life was like. And so I had to do a lot of research. I read a lot of old newspapers to really see the headlines, to see the stories, to figure out exactly what was happening. And between that and also academic articles and other books about the history, the movement itself, what was happening in Jamaica at that time, why people were looking to move, and really what was happening to them in Cuba. And it's actually really quite fascinating, or was fascinating to me, to really learn a lot of what people experienced, because I didn't learn any of that in any history class at all.
And there's so much. I don't know. Do you feel? Because I'm just I studied to be an archivist. I'm just always fascinated by any history, any hidden history. But I realized that I think within my own family, there's this culture of silence, kind of like we just don't talk about this, or some people stop talking about this and we just never asked questions. So do you feel like, was it easy to kind of extract that information, or were you conflicted about bringing this history up when you started writing?
Meaning with my family?
Yeah.
No, I think, when I asked, nobody really knew.
No.
Or, it was like, oh, let me think. And, so there just wasn't a lot of information to get from. I know certainly my father really doesn't remember much. But, and of course it could just be age, from the time they learned this when they were much younger. And trying to remember or pull some of those details, I think, is just harder for some people. But I think also in general that there is the generation, I think, before ours and my grandparents' generation, they didn't necessarily tell all of these stories.
Yeah,
I
didn't
think
tell any
there
story.
was, right. I feel like there was more a sense of, that happened in the past, let's leave it there, and we're looking forward. And so a lot of those stories, I feel, just got lost. And not just stories, just a lot of cultural stuff, because, that's not what we do.
Yeah, it's a very interesting cultural difference, because I love secrets. I was like, just tell me everything. Because because I want to be a genealogist. I've been training to do that, and I've been giving everybody in my family DNA tests, and we tried to give it to my great-grandmother, who's great-grand-aunt, who's 92. And even she just wouldn't take it. She was like, let those go slide, let them lie. So there's not that. It's just so interesting for people not to have that curiosity and to want kind of secrets to be hidden. But I guess I wonder though, you started this book before your second book, then Tea by the Sea. What do you think it was that kind of prolonged the kind of process of finishing it?
Well, I think it was primarily two things. One is that I feel like the books that are easier for me to write are books that really pull from my life directly. I have lived it and I know it, and it's easy to put that on the page. Whereas with this book, because I had to read so much material, I had to do so much research, that it took some time for that material to become a part of me in such a way that I could really tell the story. The second part of it is that the early drafts of this story, the very early drafts from 2006, the story was told in the perspective of Perline's 18-year-old grandniece.
Oh, interesting.
And so she was trying to tell this older woman's story. And I think that was the problem. She had no experience and she could not tell this lady's story. So I think I needed to mature and get older and get to a point where I can understand a little bit more of what older people experience, because I'm not there yet. But yeah, I think I just needed to be a different person. And so the change happened around 2016, and we all know what happened in 2016. But I was writing about a woman who gave up her life in America and went back to Jamaica. And so I realized that this person I was writing about was Perline. And so once she began to tell her own story, the book fell into place in a way that it just wasn't working before.
And do you feel like your kind of creative process, like how you approach writing a novel, has changed from book to book?
Yeah, I can't say that I have much of a process. It just changes. It's just like whatever works for that book, it works, and I move on with it. But yeah, I think each book is just so different. And I think a lot of it is that books that depend, where I do a lot of research, I think those books are just, it's a whole different format, a whole different structure. Partly because I'm trying to figure out what to keep and what to not use. And that can really change a story a whole lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that has been difficult for me with trying to write the second novel is that I don't like to throw anything away.
Yes.
I might set it aside and I might try to bring it back or turn it into something else. Or, does it get easier for you now with your third book to kind of know which ideas to follow through and which to kind of discard?
Yeah, I have multiple files with every version. Anything that I remove goes into a file called a sink. And so it stays there, and then I go back to the sink and I pull things out and I drop them in. But I think as you go through the process, and definitely through the revision process, I think it becomes easier to know what really belongs, and finding it might not work in one particular place, but it works somewhere else. So yeah, I don't throw anything away.
Oh, okay, good, because I don't like the.
I don't. I mean, and in some ways, this is exactly how this book came about, because I started it in 2006 and just set it aside, wrote Tea by the Sea. And there are some people who just would not have gone back to it. I go back to the books because I don't throw them away. If there is something in there, I'm going back to it at some point, and I'm going to finish it.
Great. I think I want to go into some of the kind of thematic specifics about this book. So I was wondering if you could read another kind of sample as an introduction. I think I said at the bottom of 40,
Okay.
Yeah, to the chapter break on 42.
Okay, sure. Now looking at her sisters, hearing of their plan, Perline knows that her father's request is something she has to hold close. He chose her. How long he must have waited for her to come home. She'd seen it often with patients who lingered after life support was turned off, hanging on until a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a child arrived, seeming to give up only then. She knows her father waited and wonders if he'd always known she would come home. Her decision to come home was based on something else, not her ailing father, not a selfless desire to help her sisters care for him. 30 years living in Brooklyn, and still she was seen only as an immigrant, an other. Her accent, the lilt in her tongue, and the little green card with resident alien stamped across the top, forever marking her as one who doesn't belong. She hated the word alien. No matter how anyone used it, whether permanent resident alien or illegal alien, the image she thought of was non-human, elongated head and bulging eyes, an othered being who couldn't be integrated at all. Otherness was a burden, complicated by the various descriptors news reporters and the people she encountered used for people like her. That year, the popular descriptor was boat people, and she hated it for the way it reduced refugees to that single moment when they were found adrift at sea, and the rest of their story, their lives before the decision to board an ill-equipped boat and cross the rough seas, their identities, Fishermen, seamstresses, farmers, mechanics, shopkeepers, struggling students, class clowns, reduced to that single moment. Their lives after, whether they were worthy of refuge and rescue, also evaporated in the fight over who would take them in or to whom they would be returned. It was no longer about them, the refugees, but about how their would-be rescuer nations wanted to be seen, as a blinking lighthouse that guides and saves, or a mirage of one. Repatriation was a third term she hated. It too reduced the lives of the repatriated to the single political moment when they were rounded up and returned, unwelcome castaways no longer wanted by a nation that had once welcomed them. The work they had done for their adopted country and the lives they had built no longer mattered. All that mattered was that they were other. Pearline had been two of those. First, a repatriated child born in Cuba to Jamaican migrants, expelled from the country of her birth and raised in Jamaica from age 4. And later a migrant to America, a permanent resident alien who made a life in Brooklyn. Repatriation is the one that stings most. For her family's ultimate dismissal from Cuba was a stain on her father's life. But now Pearline thinks something else brought her back. Her father wanted her back. He had prolonged his dying and waited for her to come. She's sure of that. She tells herself again that he chose her and not her sisters to hear his last words. Find them for me. You are my memory now. One is her charge, the other her legacy, both intertwined and impossible to deny.
Okay, thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the other things that I loved about this book was, the theme of migration at its center. And we had talked a little bit about earlier about kind of the earlier Caribbean books that we had read, kind of focusing on assimilation and integrating into American society. And I feel like this book and some other books that have come out recently have focused on kind of the reverse migration, right. Really the cost of these economic migrations, which I feel like most Caribbean people in America obviously are very familiar with. Your family comes here or you come here to achieve a better life so that you can eventually move back home and establish yourself in your home country. But in that process, you kind of alienate yourself in a way from your own country. And there are a lot of moments where Pearline has to reckon with that as somebody who worked in Brooklyn and who has to go back. There's a line that caught me where her sisters are kind of heckling her, mm-hmm. and she says she has to keep performing Jamaicanness to just kind of prove that she belongs, to prove that she has a say, and has ownership of this identity. And I always feel that when I go to Jamaica, like I have to, prove that I'm just, I'm not just somebody who lives over foreign. I'm from here. But I'm not. So it's. I think this really looks at the cost of migration, and also, also the migrations that happened before we were born that we kind of don't talk about, that also shadow our identities. So I'm just wondering how you came to this topic, how you came to center it in the book.
Well, I think a lot of it really is that the generations before, especially the people who left in the 50s and 60s, always talked about going back home, really coming, setting up a life, making money, and going back home to build this house up on a hill so they could look out. And for a lot of people, it just simply doesn't happen. And for various reasons, you are away for a long period of time. The people your family members, they're, dead and gone. So who do you go back to? And after you've lived away for such a long time, how do you really define home? Because you really don't feel like you belong in this country anymore. It's very difficult when I can use Jamaica, and for the Jamaicans here, you will fully understand this, that there's some things that you get so accustomed to. You go to the bank and you can get business done in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. In Jamaica, you go to the bank and you might need an entire day to get your business done, if you get it done. So, there are things that you're used to, things that you have to give up on, to try to make that life work. So I think, there is that push and pull. Where do you really belong? And I think that is a large part of the immigrants' question. You're not fully here in some ways if your concern is always going back to build a life in your home country. So, you know, where are you? Who are you?
Yeah.
And I don't know that there is any easy answer. You know, when you look at, for example, in Pearline's case, she leaves her daughter and her grandchildren here. And she goes back to Jamaica to, in some ways, chase her father's dream. Her daughter doesn't take it well. For her, it's a surprise. But, she is, and her sisters also say at some point in the book that she is in Jamaica, but if something happens, she can leave easily. Mm-hmm. Her sisters don't necessarily have that option. And so I think, again, there's that duality. What is it going to take for you to stay permanently in either one place? And it can be just so fluid.
Yeah, I thought her daughter too was an interesting character, because you don't think about, I think other parents don't think about that transmission of culture. It's like, how do you kind of explain the importance of maintaining this connection? How do you, and also like the cultural values, like there's a certain sense of duty, I think, if you immigrated before a certain period where, it's like, oh, you send money back home, you send clothes. Right. And then trying to explain it to somebody, like my little sister that was born here, I was like, oh, you got to send send your grandpa Christmas, and she doesn't like understand that. Right. I think that was really fascinating. I think also, one thing I was interesting was how layered the novel was. I think it kind of transformed, in various points. Like it starts out as kind of a mystery, and a family saga, but it does become this person's like quest for identity, this person's quest for, a family, both natural and found. And I think, that's something I think about with my novel too, is especially when you're straddling multiple genres, I think readers have this kind of expectation of how the shape the book is going to take. And your novel is a mystery, and you do follow the mystery all the way through, but you also bring up these other kind of topics and go in these other directions. So how do you kind of juggle the reader's expectations and the reader's kind of interests with your own kind of sense of where you want your novels to go?
Should I tell them that I don't care?
Yeah.
No, I think a large part of it is really just following the story. It's for me, it's usually the character that I'm focused on and following. Like where does she begin and where does she end up? And I think too with Pearline, because I went through so many different ways to figure out what her story was and to get her to tell her own story, that was the driving factor for me, more so than, thinking about genre, thinking about mystery, thinking about, the reader's expectations. This is what I wanted Pearline to experience. This is where I wanted her to end up. Really, she was on this journey to find her siblings. And, I think that's the key, that she was on that journey, both to find her siblings and to fulfill her father's wishes.
Okay. And I forgot to ask this earlier, but did you, because some people feel very committed to like following the research wherever it takes them, and other people put parameters. Did you like go to Cuba and take little more extreme measures to kind of follow this journey through, or?
I don't know if I'd say more extreme measures, but I did go to Cuba, and okay. Because I wanted to see and experience and feel, and I wanted to go to the areas where my grandparents had lived, but that I couldn't make that work. So I ended up in Havana, and I think it was an interesting experience. Yeah, it was good. But I think I followed the research with this book. Initially, I wanted to set it between 1919 and 1931, and more, like following my grandparents' timeline and looking at what happened during that window of time that would have forced them back home. But there are several things that I found out once I started doing the research, that I wanted to include. So I changed the timeline and had Rupert going first in 1917 and the family coming back in 1933, so that I could incorporate those historical tidbits. I don't want to give away too much, but there's one part that I'll mention. There are a lot of things that happened to migrant workers in Cuba. And in some ways, I think if you look at the like American landscape, if you look at every conversation that we're having now about immigration, it's the same conversation we had in 1919 through 1930s. And so there is one incident that I found early on in the research process, and it was an article and little story about 17 Jamaican men who were lined up and shot. And some of the others who survived had to bury their friends who had been killed. And so once I saw that, that really changed for me the kind of story that I was going to tell. And just really just trying to figure out, if things like these were happening and so many more people were going, like in 1919 and 1920, were they hearing those stories? Like certainly now we have Google, we have newspapers everywhere. I don't know how much of that was available to people who were still looking for opportunities to leave. So, it's like information like that like really just changed the way I looked at the experience and really tried to understand what it was like for, like my grandparents. And the other thing too that I found was that it was significantly harder for Haitians in Cuba than it was for people from the English-speaking Caribbean. They were rounded up a lot more and shipped back home and to countries that they didn't even come from, a lot more than people from the English-speaking Caribbean. So it really was just not the best time for most of these migrants. And all of that was just simply not information that I had ever known or heard.
Yeah, it's definitely not information that I knew till I, read your book. One thing I was wondering, I wanted to talk about too, I've said this before, one of my favorite essays that you've written was for Electric Literature, and I had read it after I wrote my book, and I kind of wish I had read it before. And it's called, How I Learned to Embrace Jamaican, Patois, the language of my youth. And, you kind of talk about how you were raised to be ashamed of it and how you came to kind of understand and embrace it. And definitely in my first book, I'm using patois all the time, but I think when I read it, I think one thing that struck me about your essay was when you explain, that we're taught to think of Jamaican dialect as broken English. Like basically the words are contractions, just mashed up English words, but they're actually words from other languages. And then later, I'd also read Camus Braithwaite's essay about nation language and how Caribbean dialects are their own language. And you point out specific words that Jamaican people use that are from either Akan languages or Yoruba or Igbo, and that struck me a lot. And in this book too, there's a character who says uno.
Right.
And in your essay, you mentioned that that's the you plural in Igbo. And I remember when I was writing my first book, I was like, this character, I would write it out as the character would say it, and then I was like, oh, I don't have an English equivalent for this. I don't know if people will be able to understand what this word means.
Right.
And so with this new book I'm writing, I'm like, oh, let me try to be more daring and have those words where they aren't contractions of English words. They're in another language. So I wondered how incorporating patois changed from your first to second, third book. Like, are you more daring in how you incorporate the language and how you present it to the general public?
I think in general, I would like to be. I would like to get to the point where I, at some point, write a book entirely in Jamaican dialect. I don't know if it will happen. I don't know if I can sustain it. And I think a lot of it really comes, it's not even just a comfort with it, but it's like the people I know, and I'm writing about people I know, I'm trying to reflect the way in which they speak. And so while there are people certainly who will speak patois, there are other people who will speak in standard English. And so I think I need to have that balance. And I think throughout all my books, that's what I've tried to do. I have tried to, and I think part of the other thing too with dialect is that it really does, that in literature, I think it emphasizes also the class differences, which is, a predominant issue or a major issue in Jamaica. So I think, and it's one of those things that I keep thinking about too, is like, who do I make speak in patois and who do I make speak in standard English? And, I think I need to do a better job of making sure that I have some kind of balance. But, I think a lot of it really is the people I know.
Yeah.
My mother was a teacher, and a lot of the people I grew up around were educators who spoke a certain way. And if I'm writing about those people, they will be speaking standard English. So maybe I just need different characters.
Kind of speaking of other writers who write in patois, just who are the kind of writers that inspired you, and maybe writers who inspired this specific book as well?
Well, I fall all the way back to my undergraduate years. And, when I was I went to Fordham, and is that Nicole? Sorry, I took my glasses off, and the light I can't see. So I, majored in English and Media Studies, and one of the things that I did, I started, taking creative writing workshops back then. And one of my creative writing professors, I took an independent study class with her, and we read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And it was that book that in some ways gave me I don't want to say format or structure, but really inspired a lot of the kind of writing that I tried to do, or I hope I'm doing. What I loved about Their Eyes Were Watching God was the way in which she used dialect. Zora Neale Hurston used dialect, the way she described and built and showed community. And all of that reminded me a lot of the communities that I grew up seeing, the people I grew up hearing. And I wanted to, at that point, just do something similar for Jamaica. So I think that she has been the biggest influence, I think, on my work in terms of what I think or what I hope I am doing. And then outside of that, there certainly are a lot of other writers who I read and who I admire. And if you ask me now, I cannot remember any names.
I always blank when people ask me this. Or can you think of writers like now who have just come out that are newer writers that are exciting you, like Caribbean writers or non-Caribbean writers?
Sure. One of the things that I love, as we were talking about dialect before, I loved Celeste Mohammed's Pleasant View. Thank you. And Kevin Jared Hussein's Hungry Ghost.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So what I love about what they're doing is the way in which they're using language. And there's a Barbadian writer whose name I cannot remember, whose book I can't remember. But I think a lot of the newer writers are using language in that way, and they're not apologetic about using and speaking and writing in dialect. And I really admire them, and I like it, and I hope that at some point, if I can sustain it, write something that fully mirrors Jamaican dialect.
Do you feel like it's a little, and I just thought of this at the top of my head, but I was thinking about how, I remember when I went to Brooklyn College for grad school, and I had a Caribbean literature professor, and she just asked us just like a trivia question. She's like, which Caribbean country has a dialect that deviates the most from standard English? And we had to guess.
Which one is it?
Jamaica.
Really?
So I guess I wonder, and I could see that, because I love Earl Lovelace. There are a lot of Trinidadian writers I love, and just living in Brooklyn, I was exposed to a lot more Trinidadian writers. And but I feel like when you listen, it's like people, they tend to be speaking more standard English, just with like a different lilt, whereas I wonder, Jamaican patois is like, there are more words that are from a different language. And so do you think that that's kind of like a greater challenge to, because I feel like Caribbean, like Trinidadian writing fiction always, it's like a song. It's always like a song,
Yeah, and I think that might be part of it, because for me, one of the issues is spelling.
Yeah.
Is really, how do I spell these words so that one, I understand it and everybody else
Yeah,
can.
exactly. Yeah.
Because even you take the word can't, like English can't, but Jamaicans will say can't.
Yeah.
How do you spell that? So for the most part, we would try to spell it with C-Y-A-A-N.
Yeah.
I've seen it spelled C-Y-A-N.
Yeah.
But anybody else reading that, that's a color. That's
Yeah.
not can. So it's, I think that's a lot of it. So
Yeah.
I think in Jamaica, I believe it's there's a group out of UWI, that's University of the West Indies, for those of you who don't know, that is trying to standardize the spellings.
Yeah.
But even their standardization just doesn't make sense
I
to
know,
me.
because I love my copywriter because I feel like she really tried to get it, and like she was like, oh, this is what this meant here. Does this mean this? And I was like,
Right.
no. When the syntax changes, the meaning changes.
Right.
And that's like hard to convey.
It's
you
hard
know?
to convey,
Yeah.
right? So with the word that's spelled the same way, but it means something
Yeah.
completely different. And a lot of it, because it is a spoken language, you have to hear it. Like, we can fully understand it because we're hearing it the way it's spoken, whereas it's hard to read it and know exactly what you mean. But looking at the phonetic project that they have going, like they're spelling Jamaican as Jamiekan. That to me just doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
So it's things like that. Like, how do you write it in a way that really that everybody can understand it, and it's difficult.
Yeah. That's the trick. That's the project. What are you working on another book? Or are you?
Yes, so I've gone back to the sink. One of these. It's actually the second book that I started writing.
Oh, okay.
So it's again another one of those that required a lot of research, and I really had to figure out exactly how to tell that story. And I think I now know how to tell that story, or I like the way it's working now. So that's what I'm working on.
Oh, great. I want to give everyone time to ask questions. So if you have any questions, I believe people are going to be passing around microphones.
Yes, so you can just raise your hand and we'll come over to you with a microphone so that our live stream audience can also hear.
Hi, Donna. So we talked a little bit about loss of histories because of how Caribbean people came to be. We don't have lots of great records. Maisy's working on becoming a genealogist, right? What do you hope books like yours do for history and record keeping? Is there anything in particular you hope your fiction achieves in that regard?
Well, actually, I hope it inspires more questions. Like, as Maisy said, like her family has this history or relatives who went to Cuba, but nobody talks about it. So I hope it inspires people to have some of those conversations, to write down their own histories, their own family stories, or at least to try to uncover it. And some of that is really just asking questions or having the conversations with the elders. And even some of the younger people. You don't have to be old to start, collecting those stories. But I think because so much of our history just simply was not written down, it wasn't recorded, that I think it's important to try to capture whatever it is that we can at this point.
Any other questions or comments that you wanted to make?
Hello, Donna.
Hello.
Fordham University in the house. I just want to make a comment. I received the book on Wednesday. I pre-ordered it. My mother read it in one day yesterday. She thought it was completely fascinating and captivating, and your storytelling just engrossed her, and she couldn't put it down. And she, of course, wanted to know what happened in the end. So I said, you have to wait for part 2. And I have another friend, a mutual friend, Camille, who is waiting for Tea by the Sea, part 2. So everybody wants to know, you leave us in this cliffhanger, and we want to know what happens next. Will there be, at some point in time, a continuation of The House of Plain Truth or Tea by the Sea?
Well, first, thank you. And tell your mother thank you. So yeah, I tend to get those questions about, like the ends of books, and I don't like books that wrap up too neatly. For me, there has to be. I think that the end is clear. At least it's clear to me, or very clear in my head, that this is the end of the story, and there is no part two. But that's to me. Um, but I think, and it's very hard to answer this question because I don't want to give away the end. I don't want to say too much about what happens. So we can talk. Let's leave it at that.
I love the title of the book, and I was just wondering how you title your books in general.
Generally, I like to start with a title. I like to, because I think the title acts as a way to help me to structure the novel. But this book was different, largely because the working title I had, or the original title, was Voices from the Sea. And then I wrote a book called Tea by the Sea, so I had to change the title. So, I had another title, and so we ended up here. But usually for me, that the title is the thing that I come to pretty early in the process, just so that I can use that as a way to guide me and to help me to shape the story. In this case, the House of Plain Truth really centers around the secret itself and what it is that the sisters uncover, or Pearline uncovers. So again, I don't want to say too much.
I have just a question about, because one of the books I'm working on now is a mystery, but that's not necessarily my genre, I want to say, but I'm trying to figure it out. But this is a mystery. So how did you kind of figure out how to do that, how to approach that? Like, did you look to other books for the shape of it, or?
No, I think a lot of it was just working through the pieces of the story that I wanted to tell. And I think also because the story changed so much over the years, or at least the way I approach a story changed so much over the years, that helped with the shape of it. One of the pieces that I always had in the book was what happened in 1930, in the 1920s, 1930s. And, Pearline was 3 years old when she got back to Jamaica, or 4 years old. So there are pieces of the story that she couldn't tell. So I think, that was what, was the driving thing for me. How do I incorporate all of this older material into the story through somebody who wouldn't know it or who didn't experience it? And so I think that is what drove the shape of the book, more so than thinking about genre and getting through, thinking about the shape of the mystery and any other kind of genre type questions.
We have time for one more question or comment. Does anybody have another question or comment they wanted to ask Donna before we end the night? Go ahead. Wait for the microphone.
Was there something you wanted to do and you tried and it just didn't work? Does anything stand out in this book where there was something you never were able to really work out the way you wanted, or are you really pleased with the whole thing?
I am pleased with the whole thing, but of course, there are always things that you could go back and fix or do differently. There is. I think when you work on something like this that relies on a lot of research, there's a lot of material that you gather that you would like to incorporate. And so I think there are other things that I would have liked to have used that I just simply couldn't find a way to work into the story. And maybe at some point I'll figure out how to write about it in some other context. Just a few, not a lot, but I think there are important things to me anyway to help to understand exactly what was happening. for example, 1920, the sugar market crashed globally. And that really affected what happened in Cuba to the migrant workers, whether they were able to work or not, or were they going back home. So a lot of that was kind of information that I would have loved to have incorporated a lot more of. But did it really serve the purpose of this story that I was telling? No. So that's the kind of information that I had to take out or leave in the sink. So it might come back at some point in something else. Who knows?
I find that very interesting that I don't write fiction. Well, I'm not sure this is fiction anyway. But I think that's so interesting that there are things that do seem key, but then just don't work into the puzzle.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the things when I teach fiction writing or any kind of writing classes, that's the question that I ask. Like I tell students to ask is, what purpose does it serve and how does it advance your plot? And if it doesn't, then take it out. And it might be something that you end up putting back at some point when you figure out how to make it work. But quite frankly, if it does not advance your plot, then it just simply doesn't belong.
Okay, I think that was our final question. Thank you, Donna.
Let's give them a hand.
Thank you both so much. So I know you're desperate to get your hands on the book, and great news, we have them. So you can go out the back door and grab a copy. They're all signed, but Donna is happy to personalize them for you. She'll be just on the other side of this wall here to personalize them. On your way back from the bookstore, if you want, the signature cocktail tonight is called the House of Plain Truth, and it's got some rum in it, and it'll warm you up on your way home. So we'll see you on the other side of this wall. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.